depleting batteries.
Yeah.
I think I might have a charger brick in my bag.
This is also dead, so if you have anyone has a power bank, that would be helpful.
If we're still being taped, John, look at the length that people are willing to go on your behalf.
Well, we didn't record the part where everyone identified that John was missing, so
Okay.
now he. Thank you.
Check it this one. Don't know
Okay.
how much battery I have it. Yeah, we have it
Yes.
full.
Okay. Okay. It's good.
We're back
Yeah,
on?
thanks. Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right, so we learned that most of the documents were prepared preparation of the tax returns. And we learned, if you look at the last paragraph at the bottom of page 168, which extends to page 169, there is no common law accountant or tax preparer's privilege, okay? So bear that in mind. When it comes to tax return preparation, there is no privilege. A taxpayer must not be allowed by hiring a lawyer all of a sudden to gain privilege, right? So you can't just hire a lawyer and say, okay, now I have an attorney-client privilege. So if there's no privilege, hiring an attorney will not give you a strategic advantage, because that could put CPAs out of work at a strategic disadvantage. Okay? And if you look on page 169, these statements, it will help you better comprehend the work product privilege. Towards the end of the first paragraph on page 169, when I say that extends from the prior page 168, the work product privilege is intended to prevent a litigant from taking a free ride on the research and thinking of his opponent lawyer to avoid the resulting deterrent to a lawyer's committing his thoughts to paper. All right, so that is the work product privilege. Again, we're going to see more about that next class, but it doesn't apply in this context. And then it says, communications from a client that neither reflect the lawyer's thinking nor are made for the purposes of eliciting a lawyer's professional advice, other legal assistance, are not privileged. So anyway, it goes on from here, and at least want to, the takeaway from this entire opinion is the vast majority of the documentation that was conducted by this accountant/attorney was done with respect to tax return preparation, and as such, there's no protection. Everyone agree? So the IRS can get access to these information. And again, documents can be tainted. Look on page 170. And what I mean by the word tainted, right? The first paragraph. Put differently, a dual purpose document prepared for use in preparing tax returns and for use in litigation, is not privileged. So you have a dual document, it's going to lose its privilege. Otherwise, people in or contemplating litigation would be able to invoke and effect an accountant's privilege. So you can't think to yourself, gee, we'll achieve our objectives through the back door. Not going to happen. And the authors point out, or the judge or the Seventh Circuit points out, towards the end of the opinion, at the time, Code Section 7525 is, depending on how old you are, fairly recent vintage. Code Section 7525 has not been around for 50, 60 years. So I have to be careful when I say fairly recent vintage. It's about 20 some odd years old, which in my world is somewhat recent vintage. It's relatively new at the time this opinion is being issued, but the court concludes that even this protection would not extend. Section 7525 would not, even if it had been in effect, wouldn't have safeguarded this information. Okay? Everyone get it? tax return preparation, many of you are engaged in tax return preparation, do not leave with any misimpression that information, or some of you have people fill out, the questionnaire. John, if you're watching, the questionnaire you have filled out, could the IRS get access to that? Suppose you check off no on that questionnaire about foreign bank accounts. Could the IRS get a hold of that questionnaire? And the answer is yes, right? Why? Because those are documents being asked to be completed with respect to tax return preparation, right? Problem 4-10 on page 171. Are documents prepared by a lawyer or federally authorized tax practitioner in connection with an IRS audit protected by privilege? And Peter, you're going to say?
No,
And why not?
because if anything that is pertaining to the actual preparation of the tax return is, I guess, open, you can disclose,
Bee's shaking her head.
because you're being audited based upon that return that you submitted.
Okay, but now if there's new papers, new communication, Bee, you were going to say?
I was gonna say it should be protected.
What? And then Dixie, who's right? Kevin, who's right?
Or a federally authorized tax practitioner. I don't know about that. I mean,
A
like an
CPA.
agent.
A lawyer or CPA?
They're treating them as the
CPA.
same,
Well, yes to lawyer, no to CPA.
but they're treated the same.
I agree with Peter
So what do you agree, Kevin?
that there is no privilege, so to speak,
There's no privilege, why?
because I mean, the 75-25 doesn't apply.
Well, let's just say you have this conversation with your lawyer, because you're now under audit with an IRS agent. And they challenge you on, like Peter said, something on your tax return, but you have a theory, right? You go to the lawyer and say, look, what code sections, regulations, judicial authority, what says that this qualifies as a deduction, right?
That's the exception, it doesn't mention that in the problem, that's the only exception, it says that they could only.
What's the only exception?
That in cases where the IRS is questioning a statute or something of the law,
Well,
then yes, then you can.
What else will the IRS question though?
Deductions that you,
Well,
put in.
deductions by any other name deals with
Tax
code.
accounts.
There's always gonna be a code section behind
Always.
Yeah.
every question, yeah, always. I mean, any tax return is replete with different code sections, it just doesn't say so in the return, but it's replete with code sections, regulations, administrative rulings, judicial opinions, just doesn't say so on the face. So, one is dealing with the preparation of a tax return, but now you're being challenged, and if you have a conversation with a lawyer, V, you were gonna say?
I was gonna say yes to both. I mean, both are protected, unless it's criminal.
Yeah, I'm inclined to say both these conversations should be protected, because if you have this conversation with your lawyer, it's more in a controversy all of a sudden, right? You have a controversy on your hands, and there's some legal wrangling about whose position is correct. Is this substantial authority, is this not? So I would say both are protected with the caveat, as V points out, as long as it's non-criminal. Well, with the lawyer, it's all protected. With the CPA, it's protected but for if it deals with issues of criminality or tax shelter.
Just by the nature of an audit though, they're auditing what was done, prepare the return, and achieve that result, so I feel like you can't really go after correspondence after completion of the return unless
So what-
it's regarding the completion.
Once the return is completed, that mission has been done, and now new things should be privileged.
Right, cause
But
it's
those
not
are-
relevant to the preparation.
Right.
If not criminal, it's
Right, everyone have that for their notes? Important distinction.
protected from
Devin, you got it?
Can you just repeat it again so I can
Absorb it?
Yes.
Alright, so, as John was saying, if it deals with the preparation of a tax return, not privileged. But after the preparation is done, it's fait accompli. Now, we're talking about communications, which, particularly with a lawyer, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not hiring the lawyer to just schmooze, you're talking to the lawyer about legal issues about whether or not you're gonna owe additional liability. And 7525 code sections is an extension of that. It says that's privileged as well, but there are the scope, ambit is more narrow. It doesn't apply to criminal issues or tax shelter issues. Kevin, good,
Got it.
okay? I was just looking at how many steps I have, 8,582, so I gotta get another 1,500 in, guys, so I just go back and forth here.
That's from the accounting perspective, right? Which
What?
it says,
What was that?
the, no criminal and,
Right, that's just for the accountant.
but not, it doesn't apply for the lawyer, that's the
The
distinction.
lawyer has a pure protection. The lawyer is impenetrable, that communication. Where the accountant, if the communication involves a criminal issue or a tax shelter, there's no protection. The IRS could subpoena, get the hold of that information. All right, everyone good? Now, beginning on page 172, there's a case entitled Long-Term Capital Holdings. And this case is referenced in earlier in chapter 2 with the Office of Professional Responsibility. If you look at footnote 7, the Sykes disciplinary proceeding, all this spawned a vast amount of litigation. And here's one more case where there was an intense debate whether certain opinion letters had to be released. Okay, there's certainly debates. And if you guys caught wind of this, there's actually 2 different opinion letters. One opinion letter dealt with the entire transaction, and the letters K and S, which I think, it's not entirely clear from this opinion, probably stand for the law firm of K. Schilling. K. Schilling. And there's another opinion written by S&S, that's Sherman and Sterling. Those are probably 2 of the biggest law firms in New York City, K. Schiller and Sherman and Sterling. And they wrote tax opinion letters regarding this tax shelter. And the question is, the IRS would like to read these. Because by reading these, it can, for the IRS at least, create a roadmap. So it could be very useful for the IRS if the agency were to get its hands on these opinions. And, as usual, our question du jour, can the IRS get access to this information, these 2 opinions, yes or no?
No.
And you say no? Why not, Peter?
Because when they're writing opinions, it's more of a, they're supposed to be neutral. And then
Oh, who is they?
KNS and SNS, they're doing it for capital holdings, correct?
I don't know what you mean by the word neutral.
Meaning they're supposed to do an independent audit.
No. These are tax opinion letters,
Oh, I'm sorry.
having nothing to do with auditing.
That's the other one, that's, Deloitte, sorry.
All right,
I
so
got ahead of the game, that's.
you got ahead of the game. Let's go back to,
That's US versus Deloitte.
all right, but what about long-term capital holding? You guys have an opinion? Gus, you have any opinion? Me? What about these 2 letters? Anyone have an opinion? Which ones get released, which ones don't?
What's the difference between the
Well, anyone want to say? Go ahead, Nick.
Well, the SNS opinion was not privileged because it was used to prepare the tax return.
All right, so say that slowly so Ming and others can absorb it.
The SNS opinion was not privileged because it was used to prepare the tax return.
All right, the Sherman and Sterling, S&S, dealt with issues pertaining to tax basis, right? And everyone knows, most of you know, I hope all of you know, Code Section 1001, right? Talks about amount realized less adjusted basis gives rise to gain and loss, right? And there's various code sections that help you grapple with what is tax basis, like cost basis under Code Section 1012, adjustments to basis under 1016. So basis is pivotal, right? For tax determinations under the Internal Revenue Code and computing gains and losses. Agreed? And this one opinion letter, its focal point is accurate tax basis determinations. And with this information, as applied in that opinion, the taxpayer hopefully can accurately complete their tax return. Agreed? Go from there, Nick. What does the other one pertain to?
The KNS opinion was for the whole transaction, which was more on the legal side.
Okay, so the K&S opinion deals with the entirety of the transaction and its tax consequences, rather than completing of the tax return. And the taxpayer here would like to say that's privileged. Now, keep in mind, and this is a term of art that you gotta think about for exam purposes, you gotta think about in practice. When it comes to privilege, something can happen. Something can happen that subverts your privilege. What is that word I'm thinking of? I'll help you out, give you the first letter.
Damages?
I like the way you think. W. What's that key word starting with W?
Waiver.
Waiver. You can waive a privilege, right? And you can do so intentionally, or you can do so accidentally. And what the court here, or the IRS argued, if you look at the last paragraph on page 172, as to petitioner's legal arguments, respondent, which is the IRS responds that petitioners waive the attorney-client privilege by disclosing the substance of the K&S opinion. And two, the petitioners waive the attorney-client privilege by voluntarily disclosing the S&S opinion, and the subject matter cannot be avoided because the two documents relate to different aspects of the same legal issue. So they keep talking about the waiver. Now, how does the court decide who's right or wrong? Because the taxpayer is going to argue there's no waiver here. So how does the court decide who's right or wrong? And whether or not privilege should apply? Well, you know, if the if the taxpayer stuck to his or her or its guns, the court would have to sort of trust one side or the other. But no, and just so you know, in these cases, you'll often see the phraseology, in camera review. This is on the top of page 173. Petitioners assert that this court's in camera review, what that means essentially is the court can, behind the scenes, review the documents, okay? Because the court is not going to blindly trust either side, agreed? So, remember, this whole opinion, guys, will not decide tax liability, right? This is just a court opinion, and this is why litigation gets so expensive. This whole opinion and all the briefs and everything that was done here was for one reason and one reason alone, just to see if there was disclosure of these documents. That's just one piece in the entire litigation. So, my point is, this case that you're reading here does not resolve the underlying tax issue. This case that went to the district court is now going to the appeals court. It's gonna be, they're gonna make a petition for certiorari before the Supreme Court. Can you think about all the resources being spent here? It's just one small part of the entire case. So, just bear that in mind. This is not to resolve this case, it's just to resolve access to information. So the court's gonna review this, and once the court decides what's privileged and what's not, ultimately, if this goes to trial, it will be settled, by the way, before it goes to trial, but if it goes to trial, then the jury will get access to some document, won't to others. But the court will have reviewed the documents. So, the conclusion that the court reaches here,
So SNS was privileged, not privileged, but KNS was.
okay, again, if you look at the paragraph on page 173, under number 2, applicability of the attorney-client privilege, it says petition to assert the SNS was not privileged. So it starts with the premise that this opinion was never privileged because it was done in preparation of the tax return. And its disclosure did not constitute a waiver of the K&S opinion. So because it was never privileged to begin with, the disclosure of that document never was going to be a disclosure or constitute a disclosure to the other. Alright, so taxpayer wins on one and does not have to disclose the K&S opinion. Alright, so that's the takeaway. Okay, page 176. This gets to the issue of in-house legal counsel, okay? In-house people. And this is not where you have your traditional attorney-client relationship, right? You have your in-house attorneys. Okay, everyone understand the distinction? Sometimes those who are not that versed in, companies often hire firms like Sherman and Sterling, McCarter English, big law firms to conduct legal advice, and they pay by the hour. They have some sort of fee arrangement. But many firms have, I'll make it up, Google, may have a legal department where they have 30, 40 people on staff, or lawyers who do some contract review, real estate review, and the like, and they only turn to outside counsel when they need specialized advice. And there's cost savings, right, by having it in-house as opposed to having to go outside, or at least theoretically. So if you do get that advice internally, how does the attorney-client privilege function in that context? Now, I don't know, Peter, did you get ahead of yourself, or are you back to Boca?
No, but
Are you back? Do you recall what happens here?
still,
You're not sure? IRS again would like access to certain information, right? And Ping, since you work in-house, maybe this case resonated with you? No? Anyone read this case, Andrew, and say, you gotta talk about it? Mike? Brian, you get there? So you guys have to hear my monologue? Alright, that's okay. Alright. So, this is a conversation again, where, or a case in which, if you look at the bottom of page 176, we have the author of a document, Thomas M.D., who was the vice president of taxes for this company. He's a lawyer, okay? He is a lawyer, but it's pointed out who does not work in the legal department. okay? Does not work in the legal department or the general counsel, but rather he works in the tax department. Now, also keep in mind, the authors make it clear, business advice. Is business advice privileged? No. Legal advice privileged for your notes. Business advice not privileged, okay? Everyone understand? Legal advice privileged, business advice not privileged. So this is in the district court, not the appeals court, on page 177. That the IRS is arguing that this was business advice, not legal advice, and because it's business advice, it's not privileged. So that's the IRS take on this. The court, by way of background, points out on page 177, the first paragraph, communications made by an in-house lawyers in connection with the representation of the corporation seeking and obtaining legal advice may be protected by the attorney-client privilege. By contrast, communications made by and to the same in-house lawyer with respect to business matters, management decisions, or business advice are not protected. So that's a big issue, right? Who's the burden of proof on? The burden of proof is on the taxpayer to prove that this is legal communication, not business communication. So court has to, in the second full paragraph towards the middle, court has to examine, this is a lawyer, but is this lawyer functioning as a business advisor or as a legal advisor? And not surprisingly, the court's gonna be solemn in here and split the baby. What do I mean by that? On page 178, the first full paragraph on page 178, 3 lines down, says, Mr. Need gave quote-unquote tax advice with respect to the financial transactions discussed in the memorandum and on the consequences of certain transactions. And I have circled, I have that sentence circled, and I have the letter P written next to that. That's privileged, okay, because it dealt with legal issues. By way of contrast, the next sentence, magistrate judge F, I'm not going to try to pronounce that last name, distinguished portions of the memorandum relating to such advice from other portions of the memorandum that do not discuss the transactions as contemplated, but instead communicate either the lawyer's opinion as to the technical soundness of the contemplated transactions and information for a third party Merrill Lynch. And that was NP, as in not privileged. So again, you guys have seen this before, that the court could decide certain things are privileged, certain things are not privileged, depending on the nature. So for exam purposes or outside this classroom, it does not have to be one or all, right? Does not have to be binary. Can be certain communications are privileged, some are not. Okay, 4-11. Revisit the problems, 4-1 through 4-4. To what extent would the facts involved in each situation in the magazines in 4-3 be protected from compelled disclosure by the attorney-client privilege, okay? Attorney-client privilege with the actual conversations in 4-1, 4-2 be protected from disclosure by the attorney-client privilege. think about that for a second, look back and take a minute.
4-1 and 4-2.
So 4-1, is that protected by the attorney-client privilege, guys? Sure, everyone agree? That's gonna be, those are communications done in private, attorney-client privilege is gonna apply. Get back to our, Jan and Earl,
No.
okay? Okay, there's no if anything, any privilege here would have been waived, right? The waiver is anytime you make a disclosure to a third party, and Earl is there, right? About 4-3, now keep in mind we're talking about a magazine, back to flyer. So in this case, there's no real communication, right? There's no attorney-client communication. But remember, the executor of the estate, Flyer's estate, is gonna expect confidentiality, right? So even though there's no communication, there's an expectation of confidentiality. Everyone agree? And Flyer's dead, there's no communication, but there's an expectation of confidentiality. And 4-4,
Publicly available magazine will be remain private?
not private, but you
I mean,
You know,
all
we
we're
spoke
doing is
about-
saving the IRS or whoever's subpoenaing it the step of finding it somewhere else, they know it exists elsewhere.
But yeah, we're just saying you shouldn't be communicating it to other people.
Oh, okay, I thought you meant
No, the IRS can get access to that for sure. And again, 4-4, it's Michelle and Tommy. Michelle is the professional, and here, here in problem 4-4, query, if you remember, the client never disclosed information, right? She never communicated this information, so it's hard to invoke attorney-client confidentiality of communication. But again, there was a premium put on client confidences, right? That information conveyed to you in, this is, problem 4-4 is a strange problem, but I get back to what V said is, when in doubt, at least in this context, don't say anything. 4-12, taxpayer receives a substantial authority opinion from lawyer. The sale of certain patent rights for $400,000 was reportable as a capital gain. The position was not with respect to an item attributable to a tax shelter. Okay, that's important, not tax shelter. During audit, it becomes clear the revenue agent believes the gain should have been reported as ordinary income, and the agent is considering accessing a substantial understatement penalty under Code Section 6662, right? 6662D. What should the taxpayer do vis-a-vis the opinion letter that she received? Okay, so the client received an opinion letter. What should the client do? Does the revenue agent have the right to demand the client turn over the written opinion that she might have received? If the taxpayer announces her intention to offer a reasonable cause and good faith defense, does she waive the privilege, even if she never specifically mentions the written opinion? So let's take a step back. You have an opinion letter, and the IRS would like to get that, right? Get your opinion letter, because it talks about the landscape of why certain conclusions were reached. Can, whether it be your opinion letter, meaning your accounting firm, or a law firm, Devante, what do you think? Access to it, and Omari, see if you agree.
I would say not privileged.
Not privileged. Not privileged or privileged, I'm sorry.
Not.
Not. And Omari, see if you agree or not.
I agree with that.
And what's your rationale? Brian, you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Why?
It was used in the preparation of the tax return.
Okay. And Nick, you agree?
Yep.
What makes you think it's, prepared in preparation of the tax return?
7525B, the section not apply to communicate regarding the tax return.
Say again, Viva?
7525B, the
Fine,
section.
fine. Let's talk about, before we talk about the privilege. We all know under the federal case, if work is done in preparation of a tax return, it's not privileged. Agreed? If you get a long opinion about the appropriate tax treatment of a patent, like virtually any opinion, ultimately some of that is going to end up on the tax return. Agreed? But let's take work papers. Depreciation work papers. Those are really important for the preparation of a tax return. Agreed? Those will be instrumental. By way of contrast, though, a long written opinion about the pros, cons, in-betweens, and judicial, administrative authority about whether or not patents are capital assets or non-capital assets, ultimately, yes, a facet will end up on the tax return. But that's really in the nature of legal advice, right? How this should be treated for tax purposes. So, I would argue, if you hear, I'm a little biased here, I would argue that this is in the nature of privileged information because it's legal in nature, and therefore the IRS should not be able to get a copy of this, and that should not be able, the agency should not. The question is, if you is that true with respect to an accountant as well? A lot of accounting firms draft these very detailed opinions, right? We just saw with BDO or one of the major accounting firms, or we will see, can the IRS get it? Law firm, we said, privileged. What about if an accounting firm writes this, privileged or not?
It's privileged as long as it's not criminal or tax resolution.
Okay. Well, the authors say specifically, right? The authors said it did not deal with the tax shelter, right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing, we're told, that makes it criminal. So at least in the context of this problem, it should be privileged whether a lawyer drafts it or an accountant drafts this. Lawyer or accountant should be privileged. Now, suppose the taxpayer says, once the IRS starts auditing and says it's ordinary income and I'm going to assess a penalty, can there be, can the client, meaning the taxpayer, can the taxpayer argue reasonable cause under Code Section 6664? And say, look, I paid BDO $50,000 for an opinion. I didn't just do this recklessly. I spent $50,000 for an opinion letter. If you do that, what do you do? What do you do, V?
Waiver.
Waive, right? I mean, you just waived your privilege.
Privilege, yeah.
repeat that? How did it waive the privilege?
Well, you've said you had reliance in taking this tax return position, based on the opinion letter. Four 13. So, Devontae, you got that? That this, this is one of those situations where privilege may protect both, whether it be an attorney or accountant, but that privilege may be waived.
Okay.
4-13. Large company, publicly traded, whose books are audited annually as required by federal securities law. During the annual financial audit by a Big Four accounting firm, the engagement team obtained a memo prepared in-house by a large company regarding a potential contingent liability. The memo, which documented the company's conclusions regarding the loss contingency, indicated that Large Co's conclusion that an accrual was not required was based on the written advice of counsel. Big Four has asked Large Co for a copy of counsel's advice, which it intends to file in its work papers, okay? Because it wants it, for GAAP purposes, it wants a clean bill of health, okay? For GAAP purposes. Would you advise large company to turn over the written advice? What do you suppose would be the consequences of Large Co if it refused to turn over the advice?
So if they do turn it over, it voids their privilege, right?
Why?
Because it's a third party.
Well, it's a waiver of the privilege.
Right.
So if you turn over this memo, you risk waiving the privilege. Okay. Now, to add to your notes, and this is an important add-on. The fact you have waived the attorney-client privilege does not mean that you necessarily waive the work product doctrine. So, for your notes, let me just repeat that because sometimes people, the fact, I'll just say it broadly and then specifically, the fact you waive one privilege doesn't mean necessarily that you waive a second privilege. And I'll repeat it one more time in this context with respect to 4-13. The fact that you waive the attorney-client privilege by making disclosure does not necessarily mean, and we're going to see cases like this, you waive the attorney work product doctrine. Those are two separate concepts, and the fact you waive one doesn't mean you necessarily waive the other. All right, so, and you're going to see that more on Saturday, so just a little foreshadowing for your notes. All right. So, the authors below point out, this is on page 179, that non-legal advice is not protected. Repeat, legal advice is protected, non-legal advice, like business planning advice, is not protected, communications.
Where do they really draw that line? Because I feel like that's kind of a gray point.
Well, again, these are great points, but business advice on how to be more profitable
Right. versus
versus legal advice is what are the parameters of the law. John, but there are overlap. Tax shelter advice, again, for accountants, not protected. Take a look at code section 7525 again. and look at, because we have our next case here, Valero. If you look at 7525B, remember, the privilege does not extend with respect to tax shelters, agreed? So let's read B together. It says, the privilege under subsection A shall not apply to any written communications which is between a federally authorized tax practitioner, namely a CPA, and any person, director or officer, employee, agent, or representative of the person, or any other person holding a capital or profits interest in the person, and, so it's conjunctive. So you gotta meet the first condition, and you gotta meet the second condition in B, so you gotta meet B1 and B2. What does B2 say? And that's what this whole case turns on. In connection with the promotion, circle the word promotion. With the promotion of the direct or indirect participation of the person in any tax shelter. In connection with the promotion of the direct or indirect participation of the person in any tax shelter. So, the court in Valero this is the Seventh Circuit, has to decide what does the word promotion mean. What does the word promotion mean? Because, by the way, the lower court here, on page 180, the lower court, here's a shocker, is going to decide some documents were privileged, some documents were not privileged. And par for the course we're going to learn, the IRS is going to issue a summons to Arthur Anderson seeking all documents. And what does the tax advisor do? The term of art is it seeks, and you'll see this on page 181, after the indented language. It says Valero, as a third party, asked the district court to quash the summons. The verb is quash. It's a good word for Scrabble. Get rid of your Q. Quash. Okay, so after that language about quashing the summons, the court sets forth what the taxpayer's position is. Taxpayer's position is the summons was overbroad, and the documents are protected by either the work product doctrine or the practitioner-client privilege. And the IRS, on the other hand, later in that same paragraph says the summons was appropriate, that they were discoverable because it was made in promotion of a tax shelter, and a tax shelter is not protected under 7525B. Court wants to give you a general landscape of what's going on here. Says there is no attorney-client privilege in general, and it cites to our case, Frederick. That's the first case we looked at, right, guys? So, accounting advice generally, as that paragraph concludes, accounting advice is generally not privileged advice. Everyone agree? Accounting advice is not privileged advice. And it points out that preparation of tax returns is not privileged. On the page 182, this is important. the paragraph that goes from page 181 to 182, the last sentence says, this circumcised reading of the tax practitioner client privilege is in sync with our general take on privileges, which we construe. Notice I have circled in red the word narrowly, because they are in derogation of the search for truth, right? So the court says, we do not look upon privileges fondly, right? Why? Because privileges, truth, they get in the way of potentially carrying out justice, right? Everyone agree? The privileges may get in the way of getting to the essence. So courts generally, guys, construe privileges narrowly, right?
Is there any variation of like spousal privilege that applies in tax returns?
What do you mean by spousal? And not to my knowledge.
There's like, I don't know, some situation where they're filing separately, but like, you know, still on amicable terms. And
Yeah, but who's gonna invoke the spousal? There is no, let me just say this, no spousal privilege.
kind of what they're assuming, but.
All right, just for the record, no spousal privilege, you guys. Guys, then the court gets to the heart of the matter, because it has to decide, does code section 7525 apply? And the taxpayer jumps up and down. I won't jump up and down for you, but the taxpayer does and says, 7525, we're protected, that the exception doesn't apply because the taxpayer, we were not involved in the promotion of a tax shelter. Because it reads the word promotion to mean that Congress did not want to protect, excuse my language, the real scumbags out there who were going to promote cookie cutter tax shelters that they would get 1,000 people to subscribe. They didn't want to allow people, those tax practitioners who I'm making this up, who cold called people to say we can save you tax money. That was promotion of a tax shelter, right? These were people who were, actively engaged. But here, the taxpayer was rendering tax advice for one taxpayer and helping them save tax dollars. Yes, it was through a shelter-like device that would save the taxpayer thousands and thousands of dollars, right? But the IRS is saying, hey, you were promoting a tax shelter, right? Because you pitched the use of this device to save money, but the taxpayer says, no, you're reading the word promotion wrong. Congress, when it instituted the Code Section 7525, meant promotion like you were really bad. Not that if you're a little bad, that was okay. That's the taxpayer's read on it. Who does the court side with? Who prevails here? How does the court read it?
Doesn't the clause say in any tax shelter?
Yeah, the court says the word promotion means any tax shelter, not, you didn't have to engage in cookie cutting tax shelters. Any tax shelter was sufficient to void the privilege, okay? The promotion of any tax shelter was sufficient to void the privilege. You were gonna say, Kevin?
No. I was just thinking.
Okay, I heard you out loud thinking.
Where do they define tax shelter in the code?
6662D. You'll see a definition there. Very broad definition.
Yeah, I feel like, depending on how you construe it, it can.
Any device used for tax savings, essentially. All right. Now, I just point out on page 184, if you don't mind me saying, when the taxpayer, or IRS for that matter, if you're a litigant in a case and you have to rely on legislative history of what the debate was in Congress, you probably have a losing case, okay? If you look at, the taxpayer was relying on statements being made on the Senate floor, that's probably not a strong sign that you had the right position. It might, theoretically, it might win you the day, but probably not gonna be what gets to the promised land of victory.
They're still debating at that point though, right?
Yeah, it was still a debate, and who knows.
It may not
By the
go
way,
anywhere.
have any of you ever gone to Congress and watched these debates? No one in this room has ever gone to DC and watched?
We see it on the TV.
See,
Okay, you've seen it on C-SPAN at least?
Yeah.
But the one thing you miss in C-SPAN that you can go, is that often they're talking to, they're not talking to a wall, but they might as well be, because there's no one else in the chambers. And they want to get something on the legislative record of how they stood up and fought for A, B, or C, but it's just talking into the wind. That's my point. I've seen these things. And if you, I don't know, does C-SPAN only have the picture of the person talking, or do they have the entire chamber?
Sometimes they fill the chamber and you see how empty it is though. It's not.
I mean, it's a rarity where there's an intense debate and everyone's, going back and forth.
I never watched C-SPAN.
You never did?
No.
All right, go channel surf and turn it on. I have to tell you, they talk about guilty pleasures, so there's some things that, particularly on tape, I shouldn't admit. But again, channel surfing. How many of you guys have seen, I forget the exact name, Mike and Dave's Wedding? No? No. Pretty funny movie, I have to say, but it's not gonna win any Academy Awards. Anyone do anything this weekend that they say you have to do?
We had the exam.
I have to take final exam.
Yeah.
But that, you took on Saturday, so you had Saturday night and Sunday
And then,
to party.
and then we had sub-zero weather.
It's hard to party in sub-zero weather.
Yeah.
Oh, and how many of you, did any of you see the Red Blood Wolf Moon?
Kind of.
I had the
I saw,
I saw.
I saw it as it was almost done.
Midnight.
I went to sleep and I knew I should be watching it. So I slept lightly, and at midnight, I'm going around my house to different windows, and there was some cloud cover. And I'm telling you, I spent 10 minutes walking, I didn't see it, went back to bed, and at 4 in the morning when I usually get up, there it was a bright white moon, but I never got to see the reddish color.
Not a red.
Well, I saw it when the eclipse was passing. I mean, the moon was like in a crescent because of the eclipse, not its usual crescent, but yeah. I mean, it was mostly white. Whatever. Yeah. I missed it.
2 more years, we can see it again, in case you missed it. Okay, so anyway, guys, just point out on page 185, the first full paragraph, 4 lines down, it says, the government's burden to overcome the privilege is relatively light. It need only show that there's some foundation in fact that a particular document falls within the tax shelter exception. So again, the court here is going to construe this fairly narrowly. Going to construe it fairly narrowly. Let's look at one problem.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Before in another case, I'm not sure I was in relevance, but they were making the distinction between the different districts. So what if something similar came in another district and it was, the opposite? I'm just curious.
I mean, there's a case called Golson that whatever district you're in, it's not what district, it's whatever court you appeal to, the appellate court, so we're in the Third Circuit, that controls whether or not, what the scope of the privilege. So it's wherever you appeal, that's where you look. We would look to the Third Circuit, if you're in California, you look to the Ninth Circuit, that's controlling. Page 185, one problem, guys, one more problem for tonight, okay? Can the IRS require that a lawyer known to have promoted a particular tax shelter strategy reveal the names of all persons who have contacted the lawyer about the strategy. Okay?
No.
Okay?
Oh,
No,
I think
no.
they
No,
have no
because it's a
grounds.
lawyer, and the lawyer does have the.
Right, but it's the client list. Keep in mind,
Part of preparation.
it's tax shelter strategy, two things. Is there any privilege, is there legal communication with respect to a client list, right? Is there any information that's being conveyed there? By the way, I'm gonna take the pen out here. Not today, is there confidential information, just the name alone? And keep in mind, under code section 6707 capital letter A, 6707 capital letter A, taxpayers and tax shelter promoters are supposed to register tax shelters. So they're supposed to disclose the name of anyone participating in a tax shelter.
But he hasn't helped them,
What was that, Dave?
but I mean, you're saying that the promoters need to disclose the names of the people to whom we have promoted the shelter, right?
Does it require a lawyer to disclose the names? And the answer is probably yes. They can get the IRS can request this information and get it.
Well, based on
Subpoena.
6707A, that's what you're saying, based on,
Well,
because there's a list of.
there's no expectation of privacy. That there shouldn't be, because yeah, you're supposed to make disclosure anyway. Right? And it's not dealing with, there's no communication per se. How about 4-14B? Can the IRS require that the lawyer reveal whether each such person, or in the case of a person who requested information on behalf of an entity, such entity actually implemented the strategy? So beyond just getting the name, can the IRS require the lawyer reveal whether or not such person implemented the transaction? And there's some citations that say, and keep in mind, this is from the 7th Circuit, because participation in a potentially abusive tax shelter is information ordinarily subject to full disclosure under federal law, that's 6707A, participants had no expectation of confidentiality about being identified as participants in tax shelters, otherwise subject to list maintenance and registration requirements. Compare the 2nd Circuit case, and here we're going to get a quote directly from the case. In the absence of special circumstances, client identity and fee arrangements do not fall within the attorney-client privilege because they are not the kind, client identity and fee arrangements do not fall within the attorney-client privilege because they're not the kinds of disclosures that would not have been made absent of the privilege, and their disclosure does not incapacitate the attorney from rendering legal advice.
Right.
Read it slowly to yourself. I'll keep my mouth shut. let me do this. Let's talk for a few minutes. I think it's a good idea for you to try to absorb some of this for class for next time. So let me just flip some pages with you for what I hope will help you absorb this stuff better on Saturday. Now, so we have attorneys, we have accountants working on tax shelters, we have them working on non-tax shelters, and does the attorney-client privilege protect? Does Code Section 7525 protect? And we're going to look at this, in the next, we have 4 problems dealing with this, 5 problems, and then we have USB COBOL. Now, I handed out this sample, this is called a COBOL letter. Okay, how did it get this moniker COBOL? Well, you guys are looking at it. And this is a fun case to read, so get a chance. You may not think it's fun, but it is. Look at the COBOL case beginning on page 187. There's the famous Miranda case. Well, we get COBOL, okay? It's not a long case. The lawyer here was pretty brave, I have to say. Was willing to serve, the accountant, I should say, willing to serve prison time. All right, I don't know if I would have been that brave. On page 191, there's the work product doctrine. This begins the second half of the chapter. Now, look at what it says. Simply stated, the work product doctrine protects the discovery document prepared in anticipation of litigation. That phraseology, anticipation of litigation, is not easy to put anyone's finger on, okay? Anticipation of litigation. There will be a lot of litigation spawned on figuring out what that phrase means. So, as you turn pages, beginning on page 192, there are several cases. They're not short, okay? They're not short. We will discuss each one of these cases. Page 204, the fairly well-known Textron case. We'll talk about those cases. So we have that case that goes on. It's quite a lengthy case. Different standards, and then we have the most recent case, U.S. v. Deloitte, page 226. Can the taxpayer waive the work product doctrine? Can the taxpayer waive the work product doctrine? And we'll finish up chapter 4, but it's not going to take us tremendously long to finish up chapter 4. So if you could, chapter 5 deals with state regulatory issues. And we're going to get into, can you, as accountants, be involved in the unauthorized practice of law? Can you be involved in the unauthorized practice of law? Which would be pretty scary, right? Because that could get you into trouble. If you could, read up to page 250. A lot of reading. Last class, I'm not sure how far we get, but I really do think we may get to page 250, but I promise you, given the book only goes up to page 310, that means our last 2 classes, there will not be a lot of reading. So next class for Saturday is the last class that will involve a fair amount of reading. So if you don't mind indulging me, see if you could give it your best shot. So I will see everyone on Saturday, okay?
250.
And thank you again, Kevin, if you can, if you want to bring, there's 3 slices, bring it home.